John Graybill, the president of the Curtis Legacy Foundation and one of only 3 great-grandchildren of Edward Curtis, is a prominent authority on Curtis's life and work. Renowned for his own photographic talents, John has been honored by the Professional Photographers of America, mirroring the recognition Curtis himself received in the early 1900s. Having completed his photography degree at the Rhode Island School of Photography in 1979, John has cultivated a successful photography business alongside his wife, Coleen, in Buena Vista, Colorado, nestled beneath towering 14,000-foot mountains. Coleen Graybill, a master photographer recognized by the Professional Photographers of America, is a key figure in managing Curtis's unpublished works and leading the Descendants project for the Curtis Legacy Foundation. Excuse me. Not only has she authored 2 books of Edward Curtis's unpublished photographs and writings from Alaska and the Great Plains, but she is also spearheading 2 additional captivating books of Curtis's unseen works from the Southwest, California, and Northwest regions. Alongside her husband, John, Coleen delivers engaging presentations that highlight their shared passion for preserving Curtis's legacy, like you're about to hear. With a Bachelor of Arts degree from Central Michigan University and an associate degree from Colorado Technical University, Coleen brings a wealth of knowledge and creativity to the foundation, shedding light on the remarkable stories of Native Americans past and present. Excuse me? Anyways, together, their shared vision includes establishing an Edward S. Curtis Museum, a testament to their dedication to preserving and celebrating Curtis's enduring legacy. Now, without any further ado, John and Coleen Graybill.
Well, welcome everybody.
I think that was me.
Wait a minute.
I'm standing still.
Get that out of there. Okay. So welcome everybody. As we get started, I just want to acknowledge here in Pueblo and pretty much anywhere in Colorado, this was all indigenous land. The Anglos were all imports, if you will, please. And so there were many tribes that circled around in this area. The Ute, up through most of Colorado, Cheyenne, Comanche, Apache, many different tribes through the times, depending on the time period, called this home. And all through Colorado, abundance of opportunity for these tribes to hunt, to gather food, to make their lives and their homes here. And so we're grateful for what they have done. We're grateful for the information and knowledge that they do share with us today. So as we get started, who here in the audience recognizes this guy up here? Anybody? Couple of people? Yeah, okay. Handsome dude, right? I hear that all the time, and then they say, John, I'm sorry, but you really don't resemble him too much. And good. So a few of you here know of Curtis. And what are some of the things you're hoping to take away from him this evening? Anybody? Any thoughts? Yes. Okay, the question is, what's his inspiration? Stay tuned. I hope we cover this. Any other hopes to, yes?
We'll talk about that later too.
So the question was, how many of his portraits were staged with costumes versus how they really were? Great question. Thank you. Yes?
It's about his technical approach. He had looked at and set up the situation that he was working.
Okay.
If we don't cover that, remind us.
And the question?
Oh, the question was what kind of equipment that he used and what kind of situations did he photograph in? So we'll come to talk about that.
Yes.
I'm just curious how he developed relationships with so many people.
Oh, that's a great question. So the question was, how did he develop these relationships with so many different people? And I'm assuming you're talking about the indigenous population. Yes. Thank you. That's a great question. We should cover that. Yes.
I started out with the leather bound and all that, and we did these for a certain number of people who bought in here. Just wondering, whether I would avail.
We can talk about that too.
Yeah, so the
We'll
question,
touch on it, but I'll make sure to cover more on it. Yeah. The question was, if you can, sorry, we're repeating questions for the Zoom. If you can see the original 20 volumes in portfolios that Curtis produced. And yeah, we'll talk about that.
okay. Well, great. Those are some great questions. I think we'll cover most of them in the conversation tonight. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So in some event, I didn't specifically address the question you asked, please ask again, and we'll try and hit on that at the end. Okay. So this handsome dude, as we established earlier, is Edward Sheriff Curtis, and he is my great-grandfather. And oh, and the shadow catcher, that's one of his nicknames that natives gave him because he was taking their photo and capturing the shadow. Anyway, so born in Whitewater, Wisconsin, and the family was pretty poor. It does.
Yeah.
That's what. Yeah. So that's 1868.
Details.
No. Yeah, that's interesting. How'd that get in there? Well, anyway, so born 1868, and he was the second of 4 children that Johnson, Curtis's father, and his mom, Ellen Curtis, had. And so the family is really poor. They're struggling. They have a really hard winter. And in the spring, they lose all their crops that were supposed to sustain the family to late frost. And so Johnson and Edward decide that they're going to move someplace else. And they pick Sydney, Washington. Back then it was Washington Territory. Sydney later becomes Port Orchard out on the Olympic Peninsula, if anybody's familiar with that area. And so they move out there. They homestead like 150 acres. They build a log cabin by hand. They plant fruit trees and they've got chicken coops and all this stuff to sustain the family. And when they're ready, they send a message back home to the rest of the family. So we're good, come on out. And so the family comes out except for Ralph, the oldest of the children. He stays back. And so when they get out there, old man Curtis, who had come back from the Civil War somewhat sickly, he ends up getting pneumonia and he dies 3 days after the family comes out. And this was a common thing, not that he died all this time, but it was a common thing that Edward then had to provide for the family. And he did this through most of his life. And he did all kinds of odd jobs. One of the things that he did out in the Washington area is he was working with logging, a logging firm, and he slips on a log and injures his back. And he's laid up for almost a year. So while he's laying in this log cabin that he and his dad built, trying to nurse himself back to health, we think watching out the window, he would notice the morning light and how the light would change as it went into the evening, the direction of the light, the shadows that we create early in the morning, late in the day. And we think that some of these things intrigued him. He had a lot of time to contemplate on this, right? There was also a neighbor girl, Clara Phillips, who would come by and help Ellen, Edward's mother, take care of him and kind of rehabilitate him back into healthy lifestyle and up on his feet. Well, eventually, at about the year, he gets up on his feet and he's doing good, but he realizes he can no longer provide for the family with his hands doing physical labor. He has to find something else to do. And there was a period for a short year or two back in Minneapolis where he was an apprentice photographer. And so he relies on those skills that he learned there. He mortgages his mom's property for $150 and buys into a studio, Rothy and with Curtis's name, Rothy and Curtis. And so these are some of the pictures that came out of those studios. And he worked at 3 different studios, Rothy and Curtis, then Guptill and Curtis, and eventually it was the Curtis studio. And the Curtis studio was the place where you went if you wanted your portrait done and you were anybody. This was the place to go. This is a picture of the inside of the studio at 4th and University, the final studio under his name. And this picture here, this is just amazing from the photographer's point of view. All that beautiful light, that's just amazing. So he would do all this studio work up here.
So when he started shifting, or the shift started to happen, I should say, between his day-to-day portrait work in the studio and his Native American work, we think he was probably bored because of how he photographed the Native Americans. Me as a portrait photographer, I was always bored in the studio too. And I needed that change outside and the different elements and the different locations. And so I kind of get where he went. And so he was down on the shore of Seattle and he meets Princess Angeline. Princess Angeline was the oldest daughter of Chief Seattle, who Seattle was named after. She was one of the very few that was allowed to stay in the city. Seattle had put in place an ordinance that Native Americans couldn't live within the city limits. They couldn't be within the city limits unless they were employed or housed by a white person. And so she had worked for a very prominent doctor helping to take care of his home and his laundry and their family. And so she was allowed to stay in the city. So Curtis bribes her, pays her, maybe I should change my verbiage, pays her $1 for each picture he takes of her. And she thought that was way better than having to dig clams on the beach and sell them to make a living. And so he photographed her. As far as we know, she was his first portrait that he did in the studio, the Native American. And so through these first pictures, which these are also some of the first ones that he did, which were much more in that pictorial type of style that was coming into vogue at that time. And these images won several big awards at what is now the Professional Photographers of America. It was Photographers Association, or I forget what it was called back then, but it's the same group, which John and I have also been members of. So he won a lot of awards through that association as well. One of his other things that captured his interest was Mount Rainier. And he was a very accomplished climber, mountaineer, and photographer, photographing Mount Rainier and mountains around that Seattle area that other photographers hadn't climbed to that height and carried that old equipment, because he was still shooting, a large format camera. Some of his images that he took up on Mount Rainier were with an 18 by 22 inch glass plate negative. So you're up to tell the donkey story.
The donkey story.
The donkey story.
So the camera is like a monster. Like it's huge. It's made out of wood. Smaller camera.
Sorry.
So 18 by 22, and the glass that I've seen from back in that period is thicker than what's used today. So it's very heavy. And he wants to go up and take this picture of the Snoqualmie Glacier off the mountain there. And he's saying, oh man, that's a hike with all this heavy gear. And so he talks to a local farmer and gets the use of this farmer's donkey. And the farmer says, yeah, just pack them up and he'll take your gear up and you can do your thing and come back down. And Curtis does that. He packs up the donkey, all his camera gear, goes up the mountain, unpacks the donkey's just waiting there for him. Good donkey. And he takes his picture, puts everything back together, packs up the donkey. And as soon as he's done packing up the donkey sits down and slides down the mountain. Curtis is like, my camera, my negatives. And he says, well, there's nothing I can do now. So he walks on down and the donkey's down at the bottom waiting for him. Everything's all good. And so he takes the donkey back to the farmer and he's telling the farmer this story. He's like, what the heck? And the farmer's just laughing. Yeah, I taught the donkey to do that. Yeah, crazy stuff. And in those earlier pictures of Princess Angeline that went by, there were 3 of them. The mussel gatherer, the clam digger, and then the portrait. And that's all how she dressed. That was how she was at that time back in the day. So, yeah.
You
Well,
started it too soon.
I did. So we're just going to back it up here a little bit. So one of the things that happens on Mount Rainier is he's up there doing his thing, and he knew the mountain like the back of his hand. He could go anywhere. He was making the paths that everybody else followed. He's up there on one trip, one of the many trips, and he notices a group of hikers that are kind of in a precarious spot, and they seem kind of lost in the fog. And so he scurries down to meet up with them. And it turns out these people that he brought back to safety to his camp and got them some warm tea or whatever it was, they were scientists that were out studying Mount Rainier. And there was Bert Grinnell was in the group. John Muir was in the group. Merriman from Field and Stream, was it?
Renault was Field and Stream. Yeah, a bunch of prominences.
And he saves their butts, So they're grateful and they part ways. Later on, they come back. Bird and Miriam come back to Curtis's studio, and they notice a lot of native photography on his walls, because this is a profit center for the studio at this point. He hasn't really started on the project per se. He's just making money. And so they talk to him and say, well, we've got this trip that we're planning up to Alaska. And Harriman, who was a railroad tycoon, is funding the operation. And they went first class on a steamer up there. They had cows for milk and cows for food and chicken for eggs and cases of wine and champagne.
It was like the art.
It was extravagant. But they asked Curtis if he would join them along with the scientists to go up on this expedition as the chief photographer. And Curtis says, sure, I'll go do that. Anything, so I'm not in the studio taking pictures of babies or something. I don't know. But so anyway, they go on this trip to Alaska. And these are some of the pictures that he took while up in Alaska. Some of the things that they discovered were new fjords, new glaciers, 600 some new species of plants. It was a great success in all that they did. There were some hiccups. I think there was one guy on the ship that kind of liked to hunt bear, and they shot a bear. And there were other times the group, and Curtis was really upset with this. They were taking artifacts out of native communities. There's a few pictures that he has, of course, just lined up on the beach, waiting to go back to the ship. Curtis didn't approve of that. He didn't partake in it. He knew it was wrong. But these other scientists were kind of into that. So a couple of things happened on this trip that were significant. He develops a really close relationship with Bird Grinnell, who in the time was the foremost authority on Native Americans. And he also spent some time with Harriman, the guy that orchestrated the whole trip. And he shares with Curtis this Edison wax cylinder recorder that he brought to entertain his kids with. And Curtis kind of takes a liking to that. He uses it later. So the relationship that develops with Bird, Bird convinces Curtis that they ought to go on a trip together to Browning, Montana, and visit the Blackfeet. And that Bird promises all kinds of stuff. You go and do this, you'll see Indians like you've never seen them before. And so anyway, this is one of the pictures. Blackfeet encampment.
So this.
Whoops, sorry.
Well, here too. The mountains in the background are what is now known to us as Glacier National Park, but it was all Blackfeet land before.
Back in 2019, current day, we're out in this area working with one of our descendants for our Descendants project. We'll talk about that later. And so I had one of these pictures up and I could use it with another app, a photographer's app. And so it was kind of silhouetted and I could lay it out and I could line up the mountain peaks like perfectly through this descendant, Peter, who took us around. I think we were probably within a quarter mile of where Curtis was when he was doing this stuff. Gave me goosebumps. You know, my great grandfather was out here doing this stuff. So this is another picture that he did on this trip. This is called Three Chiefs. Four horns on the left, two leggings in the middle, and then Mountain Chief on the right. And Mountain Chief is the ancestor for Peter, the descendant that we worked with. This is an amazing photograph. One of the early ones that Curtis did. And he just captures it beautifully, I think, from a photography standpoint. And this is their natural dress. There's no costumes here. We'll talk more about that.
We'll talk more about that.
Another picture that he captured on this trip.
So let's just talk about it right now.
Talk about what?
Costumes, per se.
Okay.
So in that time, costumes is the word that us Anglos used because we didn't know any better. In our terminology, it was dressing up in something abnormal. Well, their normal day-to-day wear and their regalia was not a costume to them. That was who and what they were. Curtis's son, Hal, traveled many summers with Curtis, and we have audio tape recordings of him talking about some of the travels with his father. And he said, the first thing we do when we get to camp is we seek out the elders and we find who has the regalia still. Because at that time, so many were pushed to reservations, or even if they weren't on reservations, they were forbidden to wear their native clothing, to practice their religion, to sing their songs, do their dances. All that had been made illegal. So what we've heard from Hal was that some of the elders kind of stashed away some of that regalia. And so they, you know, as we would when we're getting a nice portrait taken, put on our best clothes. We put on how we want to be remembered, and nowhere in any of the documentation that we have, and we have a lot more than what's been published, nowhere in any of it does he say anything about dressing up, putting costumes. There's a couple times when we look at some of the images and go, okay, that's the same shirt as this other guy. So we've asked several of our Native American friends, and they've said, one, you'll never get a Native American to do anything they don't want to do. And two, that regalia and those items were so rare at some of these periods that they would give them what they had so that they had something traditional for their portrait. So those are the comments that we are getting back, is that that's more how it went down. You know, when Curtis is listed what's in his wagon, never has it said anything about, you know, shirts or, you know, crossing tribal lines, which we've asked that question of them too. And they said, you know, one, there was so much trading between tribes that often something that looks Navajo would end up on a Sioux person because it was a gift to them, or it was something that was traded, or it was something that they took in battle and took from someone that they had killed. So those cross things happened. And there are many stories of those. And we don't believe that Curtis's heart could have knowingly pushed them to do those kind of things, because this project was so important to him. He spent 30 years being broke, getting divorced over it, you know, having a lot of life trauma issues, financial problems because of this project. It was not easy for him to finish. So it was truly a passion project. And we just, in our hearts, can't believe that he would knowingly misrepresent.
I think one of the hard things for us in today's world is we've seen other pictures, because Curtis wasn't the only one out taking pictures of the Indians. There were a lot of people doing this back in the day. And their pictures will show them in blue jeans and button-down shirts, because that's what they were wearing in that time period on reservations. Curtis writes in his memoirs that his purpose on this was to show them and document them as they were 200 to 300 years pre-contact. So if they had the regalia, that's what they were photographed in. And yet there's pictures, I think mostly in the Cheyenne, but a few here and there, where he's photographed people in cotton shirts, and you know, it's just, that's what they have. Maybe they didn't have any regalia.
We'll talk about that a little more later too.
Okay. All right, so Teddy Roosevelt, one of our great presidents that started or did a lot of the national parks that we now have today. He did a tremendous amount of work for the park system and for the country. And so about 1904, Edward's wife, Clara, sees an ad in the Ladies' Home Journal for the Prettiest Child in America contest. And so she enters this photograph of Marie Fisher Octavet from Seattle in the contest, and it's chosen, it's one of 10 that were chosen out of some 1,800 photos that were submitted. And so there was a painter named Walter Russell in the same time period, and Walter was to make a painting from the portrait. When Walter sees Curtis's picture, he's so enthralled with it that he tells President Roosevelt about this. It says, if you ever need your kids photographed, this is the guy to do it. And yeah.
Did I start that too soon?
Yeah. That's okay. Just leave it. So Curtis goes out with Walter Russell, and that's, oh, did you press it again?
Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna
Start it over.
sorry about that.
Back that up.
So Walter Russell and Edward go out there. They get out there, and Teddy takes Curtis aside and says, look, I don't want just snapshots of my kids. I want you to get to know them and then photograph them the way you see them as individuals. And this is right up Curtis's alley. And so these are some of the photos that he did. That's Walter Russell without the hair, and the kids, you know, bearing the dog, that's probably Quentin. This is Quentin and the Daisies. That's like my favorite picture. So anyway, Roosevelt just loves the pictures. 2 years later, he calls Curtis up and says, "Hey, I need a favor. My daughter's getting married. Would you come photograph her wedding at the White House?"
Are any of you photographers? Couple? Would you want to photograph the president's daughter's wedding?
Not today.
Not in a million years. I did wedding photography for 25 some years, and I would not want that responsibility on my shoulders.
Yeah, and he was the only photographer allowed in the White House to take these pictures. It was Curtis and Curtis only.
So after the wedding, he went back to the studio, developed all the images, made prints, and had them out the very next morning to send out to the newspapers. And it appeared in the New York Times front page.
Yeah.
The next day. This is
Yes, Alice Roosevelt.
Yeah, he commented that he could do one of two things, but not both. He could be the president of the United States or corral Alice, but he couldn't do both. So apparently she was quite the handful.
Yeah. So, you know, Roosevelt first entered office because was it McKinley was assassinated. He got shot in the stomach. He dies a couple of days later from infection. So Roosevelt becomes president. He's elected officially at the next term. And so Teddy wants to have this grandiose, extravagant inauguration parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. And he brings all different kinds of groups of people in for this inaugural parade. He wants to show that he's the president of all the people, not just a slice of the demographic. So he has these natives come down. And interestingly enough, you know, Curtis never worked here in Colorado. His miners and whites kind of pushed him out by the time he started this project. So the only photograph we have of the youth that Curtis did is Buckskin Charlie. And this is the second one from the left. And then you see Geronimo with that. That's Geronimo.
You can't say that.
Okay, who agrees it's a little odd? Okay.
John Graybill.
Well,
I love that.
I know it's kind of nice, but it is a little bit hot. Anyway, so these men ride on horseback down Pennsylvania Avenue. And there was a corner where Roosevelt had 7 recent graduates of the Indian school, the boarding school at Carlisle. And so you kind of have the new Indians sitting up there in the bleachers and the old Indians. It was quite a sight. So another thing happened at this inauguration. And
Here's Geronimo in that goofy.
yeah,
I love this image. It's one of my favorites.
it is. I mean, he's really proud. I mean, look at this guy. So anyway, Florence is my grandmother. Curtis had 4 children. Florence was the 3rd child. She's the only one that had children of her own. And she gets interviewed in the early 80s, just like Hal did. And there was an episode that happened at this parade. And we're going to listen to the audio recording of my grandmother telling us about this. I don't know who the interviewer was. The guy that did put it all together, couldn't remember who this person was that he hired, but nonetheless.
I've heard Dad tell that a couple of times, and he told it so beautifully.
Well,
it impressed you.
Tell it again, because I've only read it.
It was.
Tell that story.
It was drizzling,
Yeah.
and Dad
Okay.
was hurrying along.
Give me just
in
half a
this
second.
area.
I've got to.
So I might as well tell you while he's doing that. It's
Yeah.
entertaining. We're going to talk more about our descendants project in a bit, but in a nutshell, we seek out John. Well, John is the great grandson of Curtis. We seek out people and or descendants of people that Curtis photographed. And so we have been honored to actually interview and photograph Curtis or Geronimo's great grandson. I think it's wonderful. And
Oh, sorry, honey. I think what that, for me anyway, what this illustrates in a big way is the trust that natives had with Curtis. I mean, you can imagine with all that the white man had done to these people, for him to open up his blanket and wrap it around Curtis and protect him from the rain was kind of amazing. I'm sorry, you want to?
we'll finish that story later.
Okay, so Curtis has been doing this since 1898. He writes in the general introduction of volume 1 that he starts on the project in earnest in 1898, although there's photos that he was taking as early as 1895. But he's been doing this out of his own money, whatever he could sell from the studio. He's mortgaged the studio, he's mortgaged the house. He's out of money. And the documentation we have suggests he's in the hole about $25,000 of his own money, which is a lot of money back then. And so he's desperate to find funding. He goes to the Smithsonian, lays out his plan for the project. The Smithsonian's looking at this guy thinking, well, you're just one guy and you've got a 6th grade education. We don't think you can pull this off. Thanks anyway. There's the door. So he goes to Doubleday and Page back in the day and asked them if they would help support. They turn him down. Finally, he convinces Roosevelt to get an introduction to J.P. Morgan. And so he does, and Curtis sends a letter outlining what the plan is for this project and gets a meeting with Morgan and goes to this meeting to lay out the groundwork for what would be the North American Indian. And so Morgan's always saying, a lot of demands on my money, I can't help you. Curtis opens up a portfolio and starts showing some of these pictures to Morgan. And these are beautiful pictures. You know, they're gorgeous. Yeah, you know. So he shows a bunch of these portraits. Chief Joseph, one of Roosevelt's favorite, my dad's favorite. Morgan says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. You know, there's a lot of demands on my money. I can't help you with this. Curtis has one more picture. And he shows him this picture of Mohawk. And it was with this picture that Morgan says yes to everything. That sold him. There's a little side story, but that's different. It's more about Morgan. Anyway, so the plan is to produce 500 sets of 20 volumes, leather bound, printed on the finest paper available in the day. And they're going to sell subscriptions to this. And each volume will then have a separate set of larger images that we'll call the portfolio images. And they're usually probably average about 35 of those with each volume. And it varied from volume
as
to
well
volume.
as another 75 that were 75 to 85 that were actually in the volume itself.
So these prints that Curtis is producing then, you know, he starts out photographically making the picture, but it was a process called photogravures. Is anybody familiar with the photogravure? It's a mechanical print. So they would take Curtis's negative and they would copy it to another glass plate. So now they have a glass positive. And whatever size they want to produce, that's the size of this glass plate. So the portfolio images were what, 13 by 17 roughly, and the ones in the book were like 6 by 8 roughly, approximately. And so they have to make all these different sizes. That positive is then laid on a copper plate that's been sensitized, and you expose that to light. And that copper plate, wherever the shadows were, it etches deeper into the copper. And so it hold more ink. The light areas, the bright areas, the etching isn't as deep. People still do this today. They still make photogravures on copper plates, although it's crazy expensive. It was expensive back then. But so then once they've got the copper plate, another artist would ink it. You know, whatever color ink they came upon, they ink it. And then through a series of cloths, they would wipe the copper plate. And this is where the printing artist could say, well, I want this to be darker or this to be lighter. And depending on how they rub that plate, they could achieve that. Then the plate goes through a press with the paper on it, about 10,000 PSI. And at that pressure, the ink is actually pressed into the fibers of the paper, which dramatically increases the archivability of these prints. And so when it comes out, they take the copper plate, they clean it, they ink it, they wipe it, they run it through the press.
Start each print.
One at
So,
a time.
out of the over 2,200 images that went into the 20 volumes, each one was done that way for what ended up being 272 sets. So 272 times 2,234, that's a lot of handmade prints. Plus then others that they made for just single sale of his most popular images. So very handmade, one at a time. Yes, sir.
How many people were involved in the project to accomplish this is printing?
There was actually a company out of Boston called John, Andrew and Sons who did the printing. And so a separate company actually did that. And after some time, that company sold out to Suffolk and Son, or Suffolk Engraving. But the same employees were there, just changed names. So it was
Well, yes. So John Andrew had passed well before the project ever started. And his son, George Andrew, was running the company. We happened to have on our board of directors at one time, the great grandson of George. That was kind of cool. And his name was Mark. And Mark and I went back into Vermont to make some of our own prints with this same process. And so myself, great grandson of Edward Curtis, and then Mark, great grandson of George Andrew, and John Cohn from Cohn Editions out in Vermont. He was just beside himself. This is so cool. Anyway,
very historical.
it was a lot of fun. But it was about, I think, 1911, 1912, George passes away. And so now there's no owner of the company, just employees, and that's when Suffolk buys them and sucks them in, and that's their thing. So, oh yeah, so Morgan says yes to everything. Plan is 500 copies. They're going to sell subscriptions, so they get money up front to help pay for the printing and publication of all this. And Curtis thinks that he can do the 20 volumes in 5 years and requests $15,000 a year, $75,000, and Morgan gives him the money. 15,000 every year. And it turns out the 15 didn't even really cover field work back then. So he had quite a staff early on. Some people say Curtis wasn't much of a businessman because he was always chasing the buck trying to fund the project. Much like what we're doing. It's genetic, right? So this is titled Vanishing Race. It's Navajo down in Canyon de Chelly or in that area. And sorry, what's that noise? Anyway, so this is plate 1 for the entire volume. It's in volume 1. It's a beautiful image. And Curtis gets a lot of flack for titling this The Vanishing Race. But that was the common thought back in the day. It wasn't just Curtis, it was our own government. The Army was trying to desperately eradicate natives from this land. And it was the consensus that they weren't going to be around much longer. I've seen estimates, pre-contact, they estimated the population around 50 million. It's different what person you look at. But then by the time Curtis is doing this project, it's less than 300,000 they estimate are left. And this happened through a lot of different things, but an open, active policy of the US government for genocide against these people to eradicate them from our land. So nonetheless, this is called Vanishing Race. Curtis writes about this, and he describes it a different way. He says they're going into the darkness of an unknown future. So Curtis hasn't really written them off, but he knows they're in deep country, as some would say, deep trouble. And so one of his more famous pictures, somewhat controversial because of the title. So other projects that Curtis did, and this is kind of a fun one. He spends 3 field seasons out in Montana investigating what happened at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And he employs some of the scouts that were with Custer up until moments before Custer dies. And on the left is Harry Moccasins, and next to him was
Goes Ahead.
Goes Ahead, and then
Alexander Upshaw.
what else? Yeah, Alexander, then Curtis, and then White Man
Runs.
And that monument in the background, it's still there. You've been there. It's kind of a cool place to see it all laid out. But these scouts take Curtis through the battlefield, and they're on horseback, and they stop at a particular location. Curtis makes some notes, and we've got one of his hand-drawn maps when he was doing this. That's kind of cool in that at this point, this happened, and then they would go to another point, and instead of distance, Curtis writes it down as 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 6 minutes. From this point to that point, as he was led through the battlefield and explained to by the scouts what happened. Curtis puts.
I'm sure the terrain makes a big difference. You know,
Yeah.
A mile on a flat road is one thing, but a mile up and down coulees and valleys and up over, you know, that changes things.
Yeah, and we've been here, and it's rolling hills through the area. Some of you have been out there, yeah.
With rivers through the woods.
Yes. And so anyway, he does this report, and a portion of the report is published in a newspaper back east. Custer's wife sees this and goes to Roosevelt and says, how can you let this Indian lover publish this about my hero late husband? You know, and she was working really hard to preserve his reputation, and the work that Curtis had done with these scouts kind of shed Custer in a different light at that time. And so Roosevelt talks to Curtis, and they agreed to put a watered down version into the volume. And Curtis does it, you know, he's friends with the president, wants to keep that up. But he gives all the paperwork to his son, Hal. And he, no, yeah, I shouldn't have been. Anyway, so he tells,
Don't look at that one yet.
he tells his son Hal, his firstborn, he says, when the time's right, give all these field notes and this research to the appropriate people. And so it was in 1987, my uncle Hal gives the paperwork to the Smithsonian, and then Hal passes the next year. And so it's like kind of timely, just in the nick of time. But it's interesting because I've done Googling research back, and you can see this time period where the narrative about Custer changes. And it was along that timeline. And I think there were other people doing similar research that all contributed to this and painted a pretty solid picture that Custer was not what we thought he was.
Okay, so you have to tell the story.
Which
I'll
was,
tell the story. So you've been talking too much. John's parents aging, they were both in their early 90s. Dad was suffering from some dementia. Mom was having a hard time keeping up with everything and taking care of him. So John and his sisters decided that they needed to move them into a care facility so that it would help them. And so anyone that's lived in a house for how many years did they live there?
close to 40.
40 years. And his dad, being the only grandson, accumulated things from Curtis's children. So there was a lot of Curtis stuff in the house. And let me tell you, it wasn't all in one place. So we're going through the house, making sure, because they were going to bring in what do you call it? A state person. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. To sell off what was in the house, but we needed to make sure there was nothing Curtis left in the house. So we literally had to go paper by paper through every filing cabinet, every drawer, everything in the house, because books just have things stuck in them. There were things everywhere. I mean, these audio tapes that we have now were buried in a drawer in the hallway. And so we were all split up all over the house, you know, going through different things. And I'm upstairs in the loft and kind of doing the surface things. And I get to this one bookcase, and on the top of it is a manila envelope, and it says, Custer, keep. And I'm like, okay, what's in here? I open it up and pull it out. There are original handwritten letters from generals, from the Native Scouts that he interviewed, in this envelope, which was all mostly what was given to the Smithsonian. But I think some of the original letters that were in there were not things that were given to the Smithsonian. I'm not sure. I haven't done that research because I had to do a bunch of others. But so, I mean, then John's sister Janet yells from the bedroom, look what I found! And she comes out and she's got a handwritten note on White House letterhead that is a note from Teddy. And you know, just treasures that we found in the house. So yeah, that was how we come to acquire some of these things that I don't think his parents even knew they had.
Probably they knew at one time, but they've forgotten.
Well, yeah.
They couldn't remember what was stuffed where.
So anyway, Curtis was always trying to make money. So one of the things that he decided to do was make an ethnographical film about the Kwakiutl tribe up in the Pacific Northwest. They're actually in Canada, like Vancouver Island, and just onto the shore. And so he makes this film called In the Land of the Headhunters, which he and his interpreter from the Kwakiutl tribe helped him film this and do the whole story, which it's really interesting to watch. And it is available on YouTube. At one
Or
time,
Amazon, you can get it on DVD.
okay, or Amazon.
Yeah.
They had changed the name of it at one point to be more politically correct and changed it to In the Land of the War Canoes. And so at one point, all this film footage had been discovered and then more was discovered. So there were a couple of men who put it together and put it with their original soundtrack, which there is actually printed music from that. So this was one of the things that he did to try and make money. He spent $75,000 in 1940 to make this, and due to some mismanagement, it was a hit in New York, the first showing, and then the ball got dropped in problems with licenses, was it, or?
It was just the film company, you know, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the company at the time, but they just didn't market it properly. It wasn't Curtis's fault.
So he ends up selling it for $1,500. And that was that.
That's how it went for him most of the time, you know, spent 75,000 to make 1,500.
Yeah. So a couple of his other projects was writing a couple of separate books from his North American Indian project. One was a book on the story of In the Land of the Headhunters. The other book was actually like a not necessarily children, but they're like a teenage written for teenagers, a youth book of a story about a native boy, and it's an awesome book. It was on the bestsellers list at the time, and when he submitted it to the publisher, they made absolutely no corrections in it, and they said that was the first time ever that they've never had to edit. And so that I think did help him, but you know, it's never enough.
So anyway, so Curtis, you know, he's out in the field working on his project all the time, and when he's not out in a field season photographing and collecting information, he's held up in a cabin someplace writing the volumes with his staff. So he's never home, right? And so his wife is left at home with the kids, and my uncle
to run the studio.
To run the studio, and my uncle Hal called his mom a joiner. Every time his dad would leave town, his mom would go into town to all the social group gatherings and was never home to take care of him or his sisters. And so Hal says he raised the sisters and took care of the house, the cooking and stuff. And so eventually Claire is really kind of tired of this absentee husband and files for divorce.
I don't blame him. Blame her. Sorry, I don't blame her.
1916. And so Curtis is out doing all of his work, and they don't get him into court until 1919. And during that trial, the judge sides with Claire. I mean, this makes kind of sense. And he awards her everything. The studio, all the negatives, all the prints, all the houses, everything's given to Claire. Curtis is devastated. My grandma Florence was in school at the University of Washington. She was so embarrassed she drops out of school. And so Curtis, along with his oldest daughter, my Aunt Beth, they decided to move to Los Angeles. So that was 1919, early 1920. Curtis and Beth moved to LA and they started a new studio. Well, he's still in the same boat. He's still got to raise money. And so he starts doing this other stuff. And he got into this blue tone series, which I guess was gaining popularity back in that time period. And he does these pictures, Aphrodite on the left and Castle of Dreams on the right. And there's another one, Sunset Trails, I believe is the title. And so there were these three that were pretty popular. The one I see in art galleries for sale most is Aphrodite on the left. And so we're at my parents' house before we moved them out, and we're talking about this picture. And my mom says, "Oh, we've got a copy hanging up in the bathroom." And so we all march down there, and my dad comes with us. And my dad says, "John, his mom, Florence, thinks that that was one of her sisters in the photograph."
We're like, no, that's weird.
Doesn't look like any of her sisters, but whatever. And we've
There's a lot
since,
of comparison, we've decided it definitely
It
was
is not.
not, but
Do you-
it was really funny to hear his dad say
Yeah.
at 90 years old.
yeah,
You know,
it was
that's
kind
one
of
of my
cute.
aunts. And
So other things that he did, Anna May
Wong.
Wong on the left. And so this is, so it's got the Curtis LA thing down in the lower right. Can you pump that out? Yeah. So a lot of people look at that, say, "Oh, that's Curtis's signature," and it was not his signature. That was a studio signature. It's almost like a logo. It was branding. And he didn't mark in Seattle, but when we moved out of Seattle, everything got marked LA.
To differentiate it from what his ex-wife had still in Seattle.
Yeah. Well, and so my Aunt Beth, when she learned of the judge's decision, she took some studio employees, because she was actually managing the studio in Seattle at the time. And they spend all hours of the night making copies, making more gold tones. And then they take the original glass plates across the streets of the Cobb building, they smash them. And she did this so her mom couldn't profit off of her dad's work. None of the kids liked the mom. They all liked her dad. So yeah, then anyway.
Yeah, so it sounds really heartbreaking, but they had the copies.
So they're out in LA, and Beth meets Manfred Magnuson, who at the time was an accountant. They take him into the business. She ends up marrying Mag, so now he's my Uncle Mag. And Curtis teaches him how to be a photographer, and he becomes the studio photographer. And this is Uncle Mag's picture on the right that he did. Uncle Mag also photographed Shirley Temple's wedding. So he was an accomplished photographer in his own right, taught by Curtis.
I think so.
I think it was, yeah.
It's not, the name certainly sounds, it's in our notes on here. We haven't given the presentation. Well, it's on our notes, but given we're doing the Zoom, we can't look at it.
So this is a Cecil B. DeMille production. And there's a lot of confusion around this photo. I see a lot of gold tones out in the market of this image, and people call it Tarzan. That was another movie that came out in the same time period, but this is actually from Adam's Rib.
So he did a lot of still work for Cecil B. DeMille. That's really hard to say.
It gets me every time, including stills on the 10 Commandments. And these are some of the stuff he produced.
That's stunning. I love that. Elaborate sets.
Elaborate sets, and he's out there with an 8x10 view camera, shooting on cellulose nitrate film, a little bit faster emulsion, but that film was highly volatile, and it would spontaneously combust around 80, 85 degrees Fahrenheit and about 50% humidity. My dad's living in Puget Sound, and he's got box loads of these negatives in the attic. It's like, how the house didn't blow up, I don't know. But anyway, so one of the other projects he did was with Mariah Ellis Ryan. That name messes me up too. So Ryan was an author back in the day, wrote a number of books, and her and Curtis partner with another book, and I think it's coming up later, called Through to the Gods, where they use some of Curtis's photographs as illustrations. But the two of them work on the board for this Indian Welfare League that was oriented at trying to bring forth equal rights to Native Americans. This I think was about 1923.
So we get a lot of questions about how Curtis got around. And so depending on the time period, because from 1900 to 1930, our available transportation in the West changed dramatically. So this picture is from Hopi Land in Arizona, and one of his wagons and 4 mules. He also.
So in this wagon, his equipment list would include multiple cameras. He had an episode where he had a camera on a donkey and stumbled down a cliff and busted up negatives in the camera. So after that, he always traveled with backup equipment, like any proper photographer would do nowadays. backup. He also had a movie camera. He had the Edison wax cylinder, recorder with the wax cylinder cartridges. He had typewriters. He had reference books. He had correspondence that he would take care of while he's out in the field, trying to get more money to come in. He would have all this camping gear, the tents, the sleeping bags. He used an air mattress. Yes, we were talking about over dinner. I thought that was interesting.
One of his names given to him by some of the Native Americans that he worked with was "He who sleeps on his breath." Because he would bring his blow-up mattress and have to blow it up.
You know, and depending on how far they were away from supplies on a particular trip, that wagon was packed with film, darkroom chemicals, their food. There just isn't room for a chest of costumes like people were talking about. There's no room, and it gets better.
So obviously this isn't how he necessarily traveled, but it's such a cute picture of Edward that we had to throw it in. This was taken in a small boat that he took down the Columbia River before the dams were in. So they went over some pretty hefty rapids. And you can see these are likely boxes of his negatives. Everything was always wrapped and sealed and watertight. See another one that's bound up over here. There's a big boat in the back.
He was intrigued by Lewis and Clark, and this was part of the little project he did to follow part of the Lewis and Clark trail.
And the skipper of the boat, per se, on the right there, he called Curtis crazy many times for going over some of the rapids that he did in this boat. This was a little bigger boat that he took up the coast of the Pacific Northwest and up into Canada. Such a dapper dude. This was a steamer that he took from Seattle up into Alaska, which Alaska was his very last volume that he did. And they left the first part of June, and they still ran into all this ice. They got waylaid. It's like a week or 10 days because they had to wait for ice to clear. And I mean, they were just not quite locked in, but they were close. But this was from up in the captain's quarters. A little later on, he actually had a vehicle. And
Less capacity than the wagon.
That's true, but his staff was less at this point because his funding just kept depleting and depleting. But obviously not an image that he included in the North American Indian, but something that we find the juxtaposition between the two things really interesting. And then. Oh, that wasn't supposed to go there yet.
No, that's, I'm gonna go back to that picture.
That was in 1923 when John's grandmother Florence went with him to do the California tribes. And the car was called the Nanny. And the Nanny, yep. And yeah, it's like the things in one. The who? Definitely sound familiar. Okay, so maybe we don't get to take a close look at Nanny, but strapped to the sideboards is equipment, tend to that kind of thing, and so yeah, obvious big breakdown up in the mountains. So overall, he finished the project in 1930, is when his last volume was actually printed. There were 20 volumes, included almost 5,000 pages of text, which we haven't talked about much. We talked about the pictures. But he wrote a ton of text on the customs, the food, the crafts, the religion, the ceremonies, the myths, what were women's roles, men's roles, children, how were they raised. He included all this kind of information about the different tribes that he visited. Obviously, some places he got more of this kind of stuff than this, depending on what they wanted to share. But a lot of information. And from over, it's hard to count because you have different bands within different tribes, and it's like, how do you count these? So 100 or ish, somewhere in that area of different tribes across the West. He worked basically from the Mississippi West because east of that was too assimilated, and he couldn't get the stories from the elders. He couldn't meet with people, so he stayed in the West. On our website, there's in the projects column. It's called the Curtis Census. So if you want to know where you can go to look at original volumes and portfolios, it lists all the known sets, whether they're in individual private collectors' hands or whether they're in museums, libraries, where they're at. We have it as closely documented as I think humanly possible. It's a constant update for our volunteers that work on that, and we're really grateful for them to provide that kind of information to you all. I know the Denver University has a set. I think Denver Library has a set, and there's I think a third set somewhere in Denver, but they're all in Denver.
So, yeah, so interesting, and I should have covered some of it earlier, but Morgan, who was funding the project, and after those first 5 years, when the 75,000 ran out, Morgan did continue to fund the project. He wasn't the sole person funding the project. Curtis had a lot of other friends in various places, like the Men's Business Club in Seattle, the Rainier Club. People helped support him to do all these things. But in 1913, Morgan dies. And so Curtis is kind of panicked with what am I going to do with funding now? He talks to Morgan's son, Jack, and Jack agrees to continue funding. But in 1925, sales hadn't been going so good. And Jack goes to Curtis and says, hey, we're not seeing any money from subscriptions. We can't continue to keep funding the project unless we get something else. And he told Curtis to continue that funding. We have to turn over all the negative prints and copyrights. And Curtis was devoted to getting this project done and hands it all over. So at the end of the project,
It's like an artist giving away all their originals.
Yeah.
And saying, do what you want with them.
Pretty much. but it's kind of impressive if you put it in that mindset that Curtis did that to keep going on the project and get all this material done and documented. So when you see this last line, it says in 2012, a single set sold in an auction for close to 3 million. Curtis didn't see any of that. He died penniless with now sent to his name. The name was pretty good.
So depending on what kind of paper it was printed on, because there were different levels of paper that you could order. I mean, a full set when he was doing the initial subscriptions started at $3,000 in 1907, $3,000. So needless to say, only the wealthy have them. And so that made the information in the photographs that he did rare to the normal public. Yep. Oh, I forgot this was in here. So I'm gonna kind of breeze through these because we're getting long-winded. Of course, there's criticisms, and some of you guys asked about some of these, about the costuming and the romanticizing of the Native American, which, you know, standing today, we can look back and go, yeah, you know, they didn't know any different then. But it is really overemphasized how much Curtis romanticized them in photographing just that idyllic Native American being a male, a chief in regalia. In actuality, out of the over 2,000 images, only 122 have headdresses in them. Which seems really weird because even when I think about his work as a whole, I think about that romanticized Native American. The other thing that they kind of dig him on is that he never photographed people smiling. Well, he didn't much because the film speed back then, you couldn't hold a smile naturally or anywhere near it without facial movement in the long exposures. So there weren't a ton, but there were 35. So again, it's not a lot, but it's certainly not never.
Well, and one of the other things was dental work was not what it is today. And so people didn't want to show the non-pearly whites. And
well, I think that was not necessarily with natives, but with Anglo-Americans. That was part of why it was very common that he did not smile in a portrait. So the other thing is that Edward Curtis didn't photograph who they were at that time, which no, that wasn't really his purpose in his project. Like any artist, you can't tell them how they should be doing things. It's like, you know, telling any famous artist, oh, you need to do it this way. You know, that just doesn't work. His purpose was to photograph the old traditions and the old ways. But out of all of his images, 41% had some sort of Western influence in them. Whether it was a button-down shirt, whether it was a safety pin, whether it was cotton, you know, commercially made clothing, you know, all kinds of different things are included in that. One of them is this image. This is his final image. And he chose not to prop out the building, which seems odd to me in a way, because I think it distracts from the image, but that's how he left it. So he obviously wasn't trying that hard to take out all those influences. So one, I'd say probably the biggest criticism that we hear about Edward Curtis is that he took out objects out of his photographs, that he altered them. As any photographer, he did dark room magic, you know, lightened areas, darkened areas, and now, I mean, that's just how you develop a negative. the biggest one, well, hold it. So out of that, over 2,000 pictures, 4 that we know of, 4. There was something retouched out of it. So in my mind, to have 0.17% of your images be what people know you as your legacy, that just seems wrong to me, but I'm a little biased. So the one picture that always comes up is a picture titled In a Pegan Lodge. And as a professional photographer most of my adult life, and I entered very high-end competitions for my work. And one of the tests when we're getting an image ready for competition is to turn it upside down. And then you close your eyes and you open them, and the test is, where does my eye go? Is that what I want my point of interest to be? So you turn it upside down, close your eyes. Well, close your eyes, turn it upside down, open them. What do you see? So I'm going to have all of you guys close your eyes, and I'm going to bring this image up upside down and in your mind. And I want some response from you because, again, I've looked at this picture a million times. So I know where my eye goes. Okay, open your eyes. What was the first thing your eye went to? The white circle in the middle? No? Where's your eyes go? The beach shows beneath the white circle. Okay. That white beach. Okay. For me, my eye always goes to that circle because 1, it's really, really bright. And 2, it doesn't feel like it belongs. It is a clock. So this is the image right side up with the clock removed. Oh. But anytime there's an exhibit on Edward Curtis that we're not involved in, this is up and gets criticism for him taking this out. For me, it was totally distracting. It wasn't what he wanted the viewer to see. Okay, so we're going to wrap up this portion. This was who Curtis was, what his life's work was. So as John and I have been married not quite 8 years, and when we got married, and I actually read a book about Curtis, I was like, oh my gosh, there was so much history here. Why is your family not more involved in carrying this history forward? And I'll let you tell that side of the story.
So, growing up in the Graybill household, we had Curtis prints on the wall, but we never talked about him. My dad never talked about his grandfather or what the work was that his grandfather did. He just didn't share with my sisters and myself. And it turns out that he had a real disdain for the people that were selling Curtis's work and profiting off of it when Curtis never made any money for it. And I kind of get that. But without the dealers selling this work, it would never have elevated it to the point where it is now. And I think I was able to get that across to my dad before he passed. So he understood Curtis didn't make any money. These people are making boatloads on it. But in the grand scheme of things, Curtis wanted the material available for everybody. And the dealers kind of helped that happen. So it wasn't a horrible bad thing. But so growing up in the household, we don't talk about Curtis. We don't use his name. We're never going to do anything that will profit off of his work. And we do everything for free. We're volunteers for the foundation, so we don't take the money either. Foundation does, don't get me wrong, in that point.
So this crazy lady comes along and we come up with this idea of you as his great grandson. Maybe what if we sought out the people descendants of Curtis photograph.
She does, she seduces me in our hot tub with this idea. It was brilliant because she manipulates it to the point where I thought it was mine. It is. Yes,
That's the spice of life.
Yeah.
Complement each other.
absolutely.
That's right. So over time, I got him to come around because at first he's like, no, I can't profit off my great grandfather. My father would never approve of this. So we mulled it over for a while, and then we came up with, what if we're bringing the past to the present by also telling their story, having them tell their stories, which is really important to us, that as much as possible, that it is their voice that we hear. And we do have them come and speak when we're in bigger places, and not that you guys aren't big.
Yeah. Want to say that again?
Bigger museums, that kind of thing. Yeah, and that sort of thing, yeah. So, I said, I won't move this forward unless your father approves. And so it was right after John had given his first presentation about Edward Curtis, which that's kind of another story that we're going to skip right now. So John does the presentation for his sisters and his mom and dad. I wasn't there on that trip. And they liked what he did and how he presented Curtis. And so he told them of our idea. And Dad gave it his blessing. And so that's when we started to move forward with things. And so our goal is to photograph 30 descendants. We're at 25. We're almost there. What's that?
What's a descendant?
What do you mean, what's a descendant?
Do you know what a descendant?
A descendant of,
Curtis's photographs?
yeah,
Okay.
I said that.
Oh, you did.
Were you daydreaming?
I might have.
Oh, we skipped this story. We're gonna skip this story. We need to keep moving.
Hey.
So, I know, it's a good story. It's for the next time you have us come. So the family decided this was a good thing to bring this information that only the family has, that has been stored in this attic that miraculously didn't blow up, and to bring that material to light, and to keep Curtis's story alive, and to correct a lot of the errors that are out there. We had gone to a presentation, and a speaker giving a presentation on Curtis, and of course we heard several things that were like, yeah, no, that's not right. And, you know, so in talking to him following it, he's like, then it's your family's responsibility. Thank you. The words are gone. Your family's responsibility to bring that information to light and make it available for people. So we very much took that to heart, and that has become very much a part of our mission. But an even bigger part, especially in the times that we're in, is to elevate the Native Americans of those descendants that Curtis photographed. One of his big sayings was, I want to make them live forever. And we feel like by us finding the descendants, having them tell their story, that we are moving that forward and making them, well, we can't make them live forever, but we want to enable that and help that. And anything you want to add there? Does this start?
If you touch it again, it will. So, so when we work with descendants of the people that my great grandfather photographed, I photographed them with the same type of equipment that he used, a large format view camera. My camera's a modern day view camera. The lens that I use is from the mid 1800s, and I think it might be similar to the one Curtis used. by today's standard, this lens is really inadequate. Wide open is f8. Today's lenses wide open might be f2. Yeah,
Which
or
means how
even
big the opening is on the lens, how much light it
light
lets in.
comes in, right?
So F2 is big and F8 is little and
Fastest shutter speeds of 50th. You know, in sports photography, you might be doing
or something
2000.
moving or
Yeah.
smile is hard to get clear at a 50th of a second often.
Yeah, and so it's a participatory event to photograph one of these people. What Curtis did and what I do, the person sitting in front of the camera has to collaborate with me to make the photograph happen. So if they don't want to be there, they're not going to sit there and put up with me telling them what to do for however long. As an example, this picture that we have here in the middle, Darlene James, she's a descendant of the Hopi potter named Peo. When we were there in Hopi land, the viewer photo was a beautiful sunny day, but the wind was insane. And we planned on doing some photos for film outside, but it was just too windy. There's a big box of camera, you know, it's a sturdy tripod, will vibrate in the wind, and it just wouldn't work. And so I'm like, oh man, you know, we spend all this money and all this time to get out here, I'm not leaving without a picture. And so Darlene shows us her studio, which is where she's sitting at a table looking out the window. And I made this photograph, and this was a 30-second exposure. For 30 seconds, she sits there and holds that. Now, you can't see it, but I do have a head brace, just like Curtis used. It's like a music stand with these arms that come out that you lean the head back into to kind of hold things steady. Or else it wouldn't have worked. And I even have movement in this picture that we kind of reworked a little bit, but it's difficult. So we photograph them, as you see here. We interview them. I videotape the interview. And in the early days, we were videoing it so we could take the audio portion, have it transcribed, so we wouldn't be frantically taking notes during the interview. We could focus on the interview. And that's still what we do, but I've upped the quality of that from iPhone to more sophisticated audio and video equipment. So what we're going to show you next is a recent interview, a portion of the interview that we did with one of our descendants. And I hope you enjoy this. It's just under 5 minutes.
But it goes really fast because she's so interesting.
Yeah. You want to talk about this in a little bit too?
Okay, I have to tell you a quick story. So at the very beginning of our project, we're sitting with some other photographers from Buena Vista, which is where we live. And they were asking us, you know, what we were working on. And so we told them about our Descendants project. And so I brought up some of the Curtis's photographs on, you know, just Googled it. And she points at this image and she's like, that's my friend's grandma. I'm like, what? So this little girl is her friend's grandma. And she said, and she lives in Colorado Springs and she's still alive. I'm like, what? So we find out that she has very recently moved to Florida. She was 94 years old. She was 3 years old when Curtis photographed her. So it didn't take us long to get to Florida because we're like, she's 94 years old. So we go down, and so the right photograph is one that John took of her in Florida in one of the Alaskan traditional test books. And she is just precious. She just died a year ago at 99 years old. And because she did end up moving back to the Springs, that we got to meet with her many times, and she actually came to Buena Vista for one of our presentations and spoke and answered questions about her life growing up as an Alaska Native. So I think the next is the interview. Yes. Maybe. Can that be?
More about other things that colonize, decolonize to now the decolonization and what parts are doing and what doing.
I believe that everything happens for a reason. And so even though the Native American people were colonized, I believe that it was because we needed to see our true power. You live in something for so long and in a good way, right? Like these people that were nomadic and chased buffalo and did all these beautiful things and they had medicine on them and everything. And I know that they were grateful for the way that they're living, but sometimes universe, God, creator, the great mystery, whatever it is, it had a plan for us. And sometimes that plan is not going to happen. And so by no means do I think colonization is a good thing. But I like to see the good parts of things. I like to see the positivity in things. And so if we were put in that place, would we truly know our power now as a generation? You know, we would have done something that we would have taken for granted, which we were so grateful, it's hard to think that we might have taken it for granted. But there's something beautiful in us learning about our ancestors and trying to make it work in a digital world like we have right now. There's something really beautiful about that, and it's harder, and it's testing of my generation's spirit. And we've had to take generational trauma from boarding schools, from forts, from massacres, from battles, from long treaties. We've had to do so much to get to where we are today to just represent us, to be the first actors to get awards, to be the first Native American pilot of their region, to be able to go out and to get a degree. All of these different things, or just be a good parent to your children. We have to work harder to do all of that, to keep ourselves together. And now when we go to a powwow and we dance together, it's this feeling of a long time ago we used to have war dances. And we used to have these beautiful moments where we would celebrate together as a tribe and a camp. And we did them so often that now when we're going to a powwow and we're dancing with our people to the drum, it almost kind of feels like it might be it might be more real because we have to fight so hard to get back to where we came from. So there's some kind of medicine, there's some kind of power behind us bringing ourselves back from the brink of extinction. And to consciously do that in my generation and the generations before me that taught that and the generations that I'll teach, it's beautiful. And so the other tribes around us, they're all fighting this as hard, and we're all fighting so hard that there's almost no line anymore for animosity. We no longer are fighting over the same territory, we're all fighting for the same feeling. And that's to be connected to ourselves, to be connected to where we came from. And so we think about all these things, and it's beautiful to think that decolonization is happening all around us. And projects like this is how decolonization happens. It's by us telling our own stories and by not allowing others to tell our stories. And we're in a totally different place right now than we've ever been, where either we blend the past with the future and become a present culture, or we lose everything and don't know who we can be. And so we have a lot of tribes and things like that that are being introduced to Buffalo that are doing cultural programs that are trying to get children to speak their language by creating apps on phones. So we're all effectively working together now to try and tell our own story to our own people. And so I think that that's the biggest beautiful thing that happened about colonization is that we now know what we have and we want it more than I think we wanted it then, because it was our way of life all we knew. And now we know something different. Those who are trying to bring back the decolonized ways to ways before we put on the nation. Those individuals, they want it more than anybody's ever first conflict was to no longer fight each other, but to fight with New York.
Isn't that beautiful? So this is her ancestor, Richard Wallace. And one of the photographs that we took of Shawnee with her wild horse, her family's wild horse. She was Crow Agency, Montana. She's in the midst of moving part-time to Santa Fe. If you'd like to meet her, she's going to be speaking with us in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the end of October. No, Albuquerque, but Albuquerque. I know, I thought, yeah. But there's actually this little bitty art town called Albuquerque.
Population 6.
October 25th and 26th. October.
This October.
Near Ghost Ranch.
In that area,
It's
yeah.
in that area, but at the Abiquiu Inn. Yeah, it's a beautiful
Nice,
place.
nice place, right?
It's a great place to
Yeah.
come. Yeah. We're going to be exhibiting some of our Edward Curtis's unpublished work. Which is kind of the next thing that we'll talk about is in this discovery of different things from the house, we discovered all these unpublished images. Then we've also found some that have never been scanned at the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian. And so we put those together. Our first book was Unpublished Alaska. We last summer put out, let's just go to it. Oh, some of these are, and then last summer we put out Unpublished Plains. So it's all the Plains tribes. I'm currently working on Southwest. And so we will have the very first showing of a handful of the images that are going to go into the Southwest book that are not at the Library of Congress. They're not on the internet. As far as we know, it's only from the family collection. So we do a couple things. We do have a book that has, I think there's 20, our last handful, we don't have in this book yet, of our different descendants photographs. On the left is Curtis's image, on the right is John's image. And so we'll put it back here or up here and you can come and flip through this. If you want more information on Curtis, we have some QR codes for library. The digitized version of the North American Indian is at Indiana University, right? Northwestern.
Indiana's the wax cylinder.
So, if you want to keep up with what we're doing, where we're speaking, where we're exhibiting, please sign up for our newsletter. So there's a stamp for that, and for the Library of Congress if you want to see what images are up on there. So that makes it easy for you to follow that. We do. It's the Curtis Legacy Foundation.
Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest. I think that's it.
Yeah. But so these are our two books. They're 9x12 beautiful coffee table books. All of the images in them have been totally restored. So a lot of what you find out there has not been restored. I have to say, I think they're just incredibly beautiful books. I've seen many other books of Curtis's work, and the color is all over, the brightness is all over. From us, we have them here with us tonight. If you would like to purchase and have them signed, we're available to do that. They're $79.95. And this does help our foundation to keep moving forward and keep working on the projects that we do. We do get a little bit of grant money, but it is, again, like Curtis, not enough. And to keep doing the work that we're doing. Just quickly, the Alaska book has Curtis and his daughter Beth, who went with him for half the trip, has their personal journals in full in here. There's been excerpts on in different places, but never the full story. the full story is fascinating. I couldn't put it down the first time I read it, and I'm like, I don't know how we lived through this. It's incredible. In the Plains book, we have some of his other memoirs. We have stories written by John's grandma Florence and his uncle Hal. There's stories in here from them. And it also has like 10 different commentaries from different Native Americans about how they feel about Curtis's work. It was important to us to have them share their feelings. So
Part of our focus on these books is getting these images into the people that they impact the most, and that's the natives. We've got a wonderful blog story that Shawnee wrote for us when she showed unpublished claims to her grandpa Henry. And that's a wonderful story. It's very heart touching to read and hear about the impact this book has. To that end, like unpublished claims from proceeds from the book, we use those funds to donate these books to tribal libraries and museums so that they are available to the natives. Same with Alaska. I think
Alaska, we've sent over 100
up there.
books up there, which we don't really have that many libraries, honestly.
So
I'm astounded.
Southwest will do the same thing in that region. The tribal libraries and museums will donate those books. And then the final Northwest will donate there as well. So if you, yeah. Yeah.
So we are sharing them. We are not holding them hostage for copyright or usage fees. We want these images to be out there and seen and enjoyed and part of people's family histories or just knowledge.
All right.
So I think we've kept you long enough. So there are brochures. We do have some brochures and bookmarks, stickers in the back if you want to pick up more information about the foundation. And then we also have books if you're interested in tonight. And you can look through this.